Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's UCL LLM virtual open session. My name is Atalanta, and I'm the Education Manager for Graduate Programmes at UCL Laws. Thank you all for joining us today. So today's session is an opportunity to learn more about the UCL LLM, hear from members of our academic and professional services teams, and ask any questions you may have as offer holders. So we'll begin the session with a short academic talk from Professor Michael Veale on the topic, Can Law Stop Criminals Misusing AI? We'll then hear from Sarah Campling, our Director of Graduate Taught Programmes, who will provide an overview of the UCL LLM and the admissions process. And finally, we'll open the floor for questions and answers with our panel. So before we begin, I'd like to invite our panellists to briefly introduce themselves. So can I start with you, Michael, please?
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm Professor of Technology, Law and Policy here at the Faculty of Laws. I'm also Vice Dean Education Innovation.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Campling. I'm the LLM Programme Director. So should you apply for and study for your LLM with us, I will be supporting you during your studies.
Thank you. Alex?
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Fan. I'm the Education Coordinator for the LLM.
Thank you. Katrina?
Hi everyone, I'm Katrina Campbell. I studied a Master's at UCL last year in Environmental Law and Policy, and I'm currently working as a rewilding lawyer at a nature restoration charity called the Lifescape Project.
Thank you. Yuki?
Hi everyone, I'm Yuki Bu, and I'm a current student in the LLM in International Commercial Law.
Thank you. Gulsum?
Hey everyone, I'm Gulsum, and I'm an International Commercial Law graduate, and I did the Masters as well last year, and I'm currently doing the SQE.
Thank you. And finally, Roy?
Hi, I'm Roy. I'm from Hong Kong. I also graduated from UCL, specializing in public international law last year. I'm currently just finishing the SQE equivalent in Hong Kong and about to begin as a trainee at Holman Farwick Will and HFW.
Thank you very much. So a quick housekeeping note before we start. If you have any questions during the session, then please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're accepting written questions only during the session, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end. We also have two admissions colleagues on the call who are here to answer any of your questions relating to admissions as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Veale, who will be speaking on Can Law Stop Criminals Misusing AI? So Michael, over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So today we'll be talking about an aspect of artificial intelligence and law, and it's quite an important aspect. It's really around how people who are intentionally trying to do harm to others might be regulated by a mix of law and technology, and the challenges in doing that. So one of the things we're thinking about, and I've got the image here, are things like scams that are perpetrated by people using deepfake technology, which might be to write convincing text, produce convincing images, or produce convincing audio. Now, when we think about anything, when we study law and technology, or just law in general, particularly at the LLM at UCL, we're really interested in having solid academic foundations. This really helps us think and understand how to think through a problem. This is especially important in law and technology because we have this hype train that you could jump on, where you could think everything is new and we have to start thinking afresh about every single new technological invention or innovation or product or service. This is just nonsense. This is nonsense because half of the things we see are PR and press releases that are put out by these companies. And so the role of a technology lawyer, both inside an organization, but also looking outside at the whole world and products, services, and so on available in it, is to cut through the hype, to say what's really going on here. So if we think about the misuse of AI technologies, we might ask, why are AI technologies so powerful that mean that we should be worried about particular kinds of misuse? Law scholarship in the early 2000s came up with a particularly useful concept. It happens to have a very same name as what we're looking at now. So we're looking at the concept of generativity. So we talk about generative AI, but generativity is actually a bit of a different theoretical concept. So generative technologies are powerful technologies for both innovation, for creating and building on things and building stuff, but also they can be quite chaotic because the things you can build with them can be bad or they can go wrong. Theoretically, generative technologies, according to Jonathan Zittrain, have 4 components. We think of how much effort the technology saves, so the capacity for leverage. What does the technology allow us or other people to do that we just couldn't do before? The adaptability of those technologies. So how wide are these uses? And how easily can they be modified to new kinds of uses? The ease of mastery. So how quickly can we just pick this up? Do you have to be a tech expert to do this? How much skill do you need? And also, how accessible is this technology? Is it costly? Is there lots of it or not very much of it? Or do you have special prerequisites, hardware, software, or again, skill sets to be able to use this? So when you put these things together, the classic example of generative technology was just the internet. We could reach people and publish things we could never do before, communicate. We could just be a normal citizen without any access to mainstream media, and people could decide they want to post a post or blog, and the whole world, in theory, could see it, or a large part of it. And so when we think from that point of view, we start to see that the internet became a big worry amongst scholars and amongst practitioners in internet law. That's largely because people felt that while you could create amazing things on the internet, you could also really do bad and disruptive things at scale. You could adapt these technologies to malicious uses without very much skill required, and they were accessible to everyone just from their living rooms. The classic example of this is spam and viruses. So 2 separate issues, but how we dealt with them, and still struggle with them today, is indicative about the issues that underpin AI. So law in the UK, we've got laws like PECCA and the CMA, and I put the citations to them at the bottom. They were early attempts to govern these. They would do things such as prohibit unsolicited mail or prevent people tampering with a computer. But this relies on actually finding the person who did the wrong, whether it's a civil or a criminal wrong. And it's really hard to find those people online. They're often far away, they're out of jurisdiction. Even if you find them, they don't have much money. And even if you stop them, someone else pops up in their place. So where the law turned is to platforms. So where we can't find those perpetrators, governments turn to these really large platforms to try and see if they could stop this kind of activity and behavior. This was done both through law, but also particularly through private governance. Private governance is something that you'll study a lot here at the LLM. It's the role of big organizations, companies, and similar in putting rules on the world. So, for example, when you go on a social media site, the company might have their own policies about what you're allowed to post and not post, and then they have processes where that might get taken down or moderated. In those kind of contexts, we might wonder, well, is that platform a legitimate rule maker, or should the law step in and substitute its own rules for the rules of the platform? Or maybe it should oversee procedurally to make sure that the platform follows certain kinds of procedural fairness, even if we're happy to accept whatever rules the platform says that they would accept or put in place on the world within reason. So looking at spam and viruses, we saw a few things. Firstly, phones. Operating systems like Apple's iOS lock down devices so that you can only install apps from the App Store. And one of the reasons they want to do that is so that people can feel free to install a lot of applications without being worried that they contain malware, because Apple has scanned them and looked at them before you run them on your device. As a result, it's very hard to get viruses on a phone. It's really only state-level actors and security and surveillance that do that, things that you can learn about in the National Security Law module that we run. So hacking phones becomes very difficult, but that's because the operating system decides to govern and say, no, I'm sorry, you have to tell us before you produce any software that anyone is able to run or download. Email providers do a similar thing. Gmail, Yahoo start to aggressively put emails that are not from big providers like them just straight into junk. So you don't see very much spam, but it means that your email doesn't always get through if it doesn't have the blessing of these big companies. So it's a bit of a deal with the devil in a way. You need these platforms to govern some of these problems. It's really hard to govern without them, And yet you worry, and we worry, that you're giving them perhaps too much power to deal with these issues. You're gifting them with the power to govern the world in return with for them governing the problems that you care about, like spam viruses. So let's turn to AI a bit more clearly now. So one of the things within security and generative AI is we associate generative AI with a really high array of criminal activity today. So 3 categories of things that really are pretty much stuff that we just do not want to happen. And society is fairly agreed on this. It's got quite strong agreement across political lines. The first is intimate image abuse, people making synthetic, fake, or altered images of other people. It was formerly referred to as revenge porn sometimes, but that doesn't really capture the abuse and foreground the victim in that. So intimate image abuse, where AI is used to swap people's faces onto sexually suggestive or explicit poses and similar, is really been heightened by AI. We also see altered and synthetic child sexual abuse material. This might be existing images of real victims that are being altered so that they don't get detected, but they still look somewhat convincing. Or it could be images that are just generated completely afresh and new using AI, which are also prohibited in many jurisdictions for a whole variety of reasons, moral reasons, but also concerns that it creates and legitimizes new perpetrators and creates pathways to offenses in the real world. We also have automated deepfake scams. So a picture on the right of this slide shows a scammer hiding himself looking like Elon Musk. And to do this and sell this product in particular, this is a video from that we retrieved during our research from a dark web marketplace, well, actually this marketplace on Telegram rather than the dark web, designed to sell tools like this to criminals. And it's an advertising video, so it shows that you can disguise yourself. And he's putting his hand over his face to illustrate that the model still doesn't change his it accepts the fact that the hand is over the face. It doesn't usually say, oh no, we'll show a little bit of the real face behind the hand. It's a robust model, so it's a kind of advert for the system. And that's very common when you do bank checks. Sometimes it might ask you to turn in different directions or put a hand over your face to touch your face or nose, because it might disrupt someone who's trying to use a deepfake technology to scam people. And so all of these technologies become super easy to use, and they become really accessible to criminals who don't even have very much technical expertise, heightening this worry of generative risks. And we see online, you can go on YouTube, you can find hundreds, thousands of tutorials showing you how to do real-time deepfake calls with other people, to fraudulently represent them on different devices like iPhones. And influencers in the crime space are very, very popular. And they also, when they get banned, they move platforms to a different place. And of course, it usually says, oh, it's for pranking or something like this. But these are tutorials that just help people into that ease of mastery. Now, one thing that makes this really hard for law is that a lot of these models can be downloaded onto your phone or device. So if you wrote a message and you asked for a criminal activity to be carried out via ChatGPT, Claude, Doubao, or DeepSeek, you probably would get a response that said, oh no, I can't do that. That's not ethical. People can break through those, but what that is that's a platform that's been governing this and saying, no, you can't use our service for those criminal activities, and trying maybe their best, sometimes a bit less than their best, to attempt to stop this. However, huge amounts of powerful machine learning models from all over the world are downloadable onto your computer, onto your phone, and you can run these powerful AI models for deepfakes and other things without any internet at all, just using the hardware. And phones and computers have machine learning hardware built into them more and more. This is obviously driven as well by what we hear about gigantic costs of cloud computing. And so bringing those costs back onto the user by putting models onto their own devices allows them to run in the privacy of their own computer. But that means it's really hard to detect what they're doing and stop that. So, for example, we have laws in the EU, India, California, and China now that require invisibly watermarking AI-generated content. But if you download as a criminal a model onto your device that you want to use for criminal activities, then you can choose not to do that watermarking. You can just turn off the watermarking code because it's on your device. It's within your control. And devices themselves will struggle to ban these models, and they'll struggle to block certain outputs. How do you know if someone is using a model for a prank or for a real criminal offense against someone? How would the device know? Would it scan everything you do, everything you write, everything you produce, every little bit of computation to make sure that you're doing a good or a bad thing? That you're, should your phone know if you're being naughty or nice? That's a huge surveillance issue. It's also a practical issue. It simply doesn't work. Think about how social media platforms remove posts from the internet. Well, they get it wrong a lot of the time, and that's even though they've got really powerful machine learning models running on powerful, expensive cloud computers. Smaller, less powerful models doing scanning on your phone to check if you're doing a good thing or a bad thing with machine learning technology just simply don't function and wouldn't work. So we have really serious challenges here where criminals start to bring these powerful tools onto their own devices. So what does that mean? Where does that leave us? Well, what in our research stream we argue, and what you'll be learning about if you come to UCL in the data law and algorithmic regulation module, as well as the national security law modules, which are all part of the LLM in law and technology, we'd be learning about full stack AI governance. How do we look at all the different actors in the supply chain to understand where obligations are placed on them? Obligations on cloud providers to stop people misusing tools. Obligations on device manufacturers that are realistic. For example, this video stream comes from a real camera. The phone call I'm having comes from a real microphone. It's not having AI put into it. Companies are starting to think about this, but perhaps we need law to support this. Banning or limiting tutorials online for malicious things. Now that's a really tricky area because tutorials often disguise themselves, like those pranking tutorials, as something legitimate. And attempts to stop downloadable models that are intended or have a high possibility to be used for malicious use from being distributed. But that's really hard because models can be used for good or bad things, particularly these general purpose AI models. So we'll be looking at some of these questions. And indeed, many of these platform questions also come up in the media law module from Presta platforms, where we also look throughout at all of these intermediaries. So there's lots about this in the LLM and law and technology. And it's a tough issue for the future, and one of perhaps one of the most important ones that will be on the agenda for lawmakers in the next few years. So thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a fascinating presentation. I will now move on to an overview of the UCL LLM programme, and I'm delighted to hand over to Sarah Campling, the Director of Taught Graduate Programmes, who will talk about the structure of the programme and the opportunities available to students, as well as other important information. Sarah, you're on mute.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my shared screen. So I'm assuming since nobody's answering, you can see my shared screen. Thank you. Okay, so I am going to speak to you about some practical things about the LLM. Thank you very much for joining me. The LLM is an amazing course. I'm very happy to be the programme director and happy to be speaking to you about the contents of the programme. So before I speak to you about our programme, I'd like to talk to you about why you want to study for a Master of Laws. So you might want to study for your Masters because you've already completed an undergraduate degree and now you want to study for a Master's degree. So the Masters allows you to specialise and develop expertise in a particular area. Some students want to go on and be practitioners, barristers, solicitors. Some are already barristers or solicitors and want to develop expertise in a particular area. Some of our students want to be policy workers or work for local or national government or get involved in regulatory work. And some see the Masters as a stepping stone to prepare to study for a PhD. So this is a picture of the Faculty of Laws in Bentham House. I think when you saw Michael, you would have seen this behind him. We are at the heart of legal London and we have world-leading academics and practitioners. I would suggest that you look at the research that they have done by looking at their descriptions on the UCL Laws website, where you'll be able to see the types of research and the background of the practitioners and academics that will be teaching you. If you're interested in league tables, you could also look at where we stand in the particular league tables. So this is inside Bentham House. We're moving inside the building, and this is a picture of the student hub with some of our LLM students chatting together in the hub, where you would also find a cafe. In a different floor, there's a moot court. So if you're interested in mooting, you can get to practice that in our moot court, or you could practice your table tennis skills in our common room. The building also includes teaching rooms and a lecture theatre. So although not all of your classes will necessarily be in Bentham House, it's a fantastic building and it's the home of the Faculty of Laws. So there are many reasons to study for an LLM at UCL, not only our fantastic academics that I've just spoken about, but also our student diversity. On the LLM, we have approximately 400 students each year. They come from 60 different countries. We also have a general LLM or specialisms, which I'm going to come back and speak to you about in a moment. We have a huge array of modules. You're lucky enough to be able to do some research into an area that you're particularly interested in if you wish to, when you write your research essay. Another thing that is different about the LLM at UCL is that it's a 10-month programme rather than a 12-month programme, which means that you finish at the beginning of the summer and then you can go and enter the jobs market or go and spend a summer travelling without worrying about submitting a dissertation at the end of the summer. So it's different. It's a 10-month programme. We also have a huge array of extracurricular activities, which I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, and our own specific Laws Careers Service. So the specialisms that we've got planned for next year, you can see that we are offering approximately 15 different specialisms, and they range from human rights, intellectual property, law and social justice, litigation dispute resolution. You can see there's a very wide range of specialisms. And although you may want to do a specialism, you may want to study the general LLM. Next year, we have our new specialism, which Michael spoke about, which is in law and technology. And in order to qualify for a specialism, you need to study at least 60 credits of the modules within that specialism. So, for example, you might want to study data law and national security law. That would be 90 credits. That would qualify you for the specialism as far as the taught modules go, but you would also need to write a research essay in an area that was connected to that specialism. Now, some people might choose to study all of the modules within the specialism, and some may choose to study 2 modules in the specialism and maybe one from our other general list of modules. This slide is to show you the huge range of modules to choose from. So if you're studying the general LLM, you need to do 135 credits of taught modules, and you can see there is a vast number of modules. This year we're offering nearly 60 different modules, including competition law, environmental law, international comparative secured transactions, cross-border mergers and acquisitions, copyright, judges, Jeremy Bentham, climate change, huge range of modules. So my advice to you when thinking about whether you want to study your LLM with us is to carefully consider the contents of the modules by looking online in the module catalogue, where you will find each module described and information about the module. Obviously, we can't always guarantee that every module will be taught, because sometimes things happen and sometimes modules get changed. But this is our plans at the moment. In terms of resources and studying, we have LLM students have membership of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, which is one of the best law libraries in the world. So you'll find the LLM students in the aisle studying, writing their research essays at this very moment, probably. There's also a law library in the university and a brand new student centre, which is often open for 24 hours. This is a picture of the student centre. The programme you can study either full-time over 10 months, part-time over 2 years, or on a flexible basis over 5 years. As I say, the programme is 10 months long. It starts with an induction week where all the students meet together. It then, for the taught modules, you then are taught in classes in term 1 and term 2. And then in term 3, you take part in your assessments, you submit your assessments. That makes up 135 credits of the taught modules. And as I say, alongside those, you are lucky enough to do a research essay, which gives you the ability to research and study an area that you're particularly interested in. So you can choose your subject to research and write about, and you will be supported by a supervisor and a PhD student, along with lectures and colloquia, which will help you decide what to write about, to carry out the research and to write. And the research essay constitutes a quarter of your master's course. So in total, you need to successfully complete 180 credits. We have a wide range of extracurricular activities, including you could write and edit a journal of law and jurisprudence. We have a Centre for Access to Justice where you could practice your advisory skills with real clients. We have a graduate law society, an academic legal writing course, and lots of other opportunities for extracurricular activities. Our entry requirements are set out on the website. You can see that we have academic requirements as well as English language requirements. Generally, we're looking for students who have an average of 65% across all years of study or the international equivalents. We're also looking that you can demonstrate evidence of motivation, reasoning and analytical ability, and communication skills. But my advice to you is to look at the website for our requirements, where you could see the advice about what to include on your personal statement on the application form. You're also required to produce a piece of written work of not longer than 750 words, demonstrating your reasoning and analytical ability and communication skills. You should also look on the website if you're interested in applying for scholarships or awards. There is information both on the Laws website and the UCL website. We're lucky in Laws that we have our own careers advisors, so they are able to advise about legal careers. If you're interested in non-legal careers, UCL also has its separate careers department. If you have questions after this session that you would like to ask us, my advice would be to contact our LLM admissions team. So we're lucky in Laws in that we have our own admissions team just for the LLM, and they will be delighted to answer your queries. If you have queries of a more general nature, then you could ask the central admissions team at UCL. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have some questions for myself and the students that have joined us today. I will now hand back to Atalanta.
Thank you, Sarah. So we now have around 30 minutes for questions. Thank you to everybody who's been submitting questions throughout the session and to those of you who have sent some ahead of time. We'll try to answer as many as we can in the time that is available. So let's get started. So the first question I'd like to ask is for those on the panel who've studied the LLM. So there's a question here which says, for those who are doing their SQE, in terms of qualifying as a solicitor after the LLM, did you secure a training contract while you were doing the LLM, or did you apply after graduating? And are you funding yourself?
So I'm doing the SQE at the moment. I had applied for the master's after I graduated from my undergrad degree. And so I funded it myself, but I also got help from UCL via the master's bursary, which really helped financially. And what is that? Was that the question, or was there anything else?
Did you secure this while you were doing the LLM or after, and are you funding yourself? So
so basically I got a training contract, and so the SQE is funded by my firm, but the SQE was already going to happen, so I had a year between starting the SQE and securing the training contract. So I decided to do the LLM to actually benefit the training contract. So yeah, that's how I went about it.
That's perfect, thank you. Roy, do you want to add anything from your perspective of doing this in Hong Kong?
Yeah, so I did secure a training contract before starting the LLM, and I think the funding, in terms of the funding of the qualification degree, it really depends on the firm. So in my case, it was really lucky that the firm is funding us for the tuition fees.
That's great. Thank you very much. The next question I'd like to ask is, and maybe this could be Sarah, Michael, and then our alumni might want to jump in as well. Is there anything that you would recommend students do before starting the programme to prepare themselves academically?
I'm happy to start with that. Yes, definitely. So I would strongly recommend that you read carefully the module description in the module catalogue. And those module descriptions often include some pre-reading or some sources that are going to be examined during the module itself. So I would strongly recommend that you have a look at the pre-reading before you enroll on the course. Michael might have some more ideas.
No, I think that's very good. There's a few things that we also offer an introduction to common law, which comes before the LLM starts. So if people feel like they want some more preparation in English law, you can investigate that. It's on the website, and we can talk a bit more about that as well for those from different legal systems. I'd also say one big part of getting the most out of the LLM is thinking about what you want to do for your research essay, but also being really engaged with current developments in the fields that you're interested in. So reading different kinds of newspapers, sources, and so on. And just because the key thing to do it, the time does fly. You want to get the passion from the subject. You want to be going to office hours and talking to academics and asking them interesting questions about things, and really hit the ground rolling. And so those kind of approaches, I think, help you make the most of your time, because instead of coming in thinking, okay, I'm now finding my way, you kind of come in with some ideas. Those might be challenged and changed, but they're good. You're good to go.
Can I suggest that the students may be able to give some feedback about their experiences of starting the course?
Yeah, please do.
I'm happy to speak. I would say I underestimated how much of a change it was going to be from what I was doing before. So I was working as a solicitor in a law firm and was working right up until I started the master. So I didn't think about exactly how it was going to be, how I was going to approach it. And just practical things, like how are you going to organize your notes? How are you going to go about doing your revision and preparing for seminars? I think it would have been really useful for me to think a little bit more about that beforehand. And like Michael said, thinking about your research essay beforehand as well. I don't think you need to, you don't need to have an exact idea of what you're going to be covering for that, but it's good to start thinking about ideas. And I know my topic changed completely from the beginning of the year to what I actually produced, but it's definitely helpful to start thinking about those things. And yeah, I think it depends kind of where you're coming from before you start the masters. But for me, it was a huge change from working and it much more having to self-motivate yourself. So if you're in the working world, be prepared for that.
Any of our other alumni want to jump in and add?
Yeah, just to add on to what Katrina said as well, I think for me, before I started, I'd spoken to some UCL alumni and they recommended making a list of topics on my potential research essay question. So I did make some titles that, could have been the case. And at the end of it, they were completely different to the end title. But, it did help trying to get there. So I gathered resources. Maybe that's something that you could do, gathered resources on some potential titles that you could have, and not just on one topic, maybe on a couple topics. I'd also say if you're not a home student, get to know London. Once you get your accommodation, try and look at any cafes that you could study at. Because I think it's one thing studying at an institution, but I also think you should get to know the area very well. And again, like I said, just speak to some UCL alumni. You can connect with them on LinkedIn. People have been connecting with me and been getting through the program. And yeah, those are my 3 pieces of advice.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Michael, we've had quite a few questions for you in the chat, which hopefully you've had a chance to look at, but I wonder if you'd be able to just answer some of those and touch on the questions that people have been submitting.
Yeah, certainly. So there's a few, and I'll just summarize them for people's benefit and answer them as well. So one person asks whether we could take an analogy to nuclear technology and regulate AI, including regulating the knowledge of that. Now, thinking about that, obviously, we know in international politics, there's a lot of questions about who has the capability or knowledge to build nuclear energy, weapons, refine uranium, and people think maybe we could govern it that way. A challenge really comes back to that theory of generativity, remember. Generative AI is an example of something that is quite easy to master. You don't need to have coding knowledge. You can just type in your request and the technology is designed to try and do that request for you. That's very different than nuclear technology where, you have to maybe train to be a nuclear scientist for your life. So that's a bit of a difference. And so regulating the knowledge in that way is really hard, especially because the technology, you can just ask it, it'll tell you things. Now, you might want to regulate to make it so it doesn't give you help to do some particularly dangerous tasks, but that becomes very tricky to work out. So it's a good direction. There are things we can learn from nuclear regulation, but probably the knowledge governance is not so one of them. We have another question around evidence breach and collecting breach of evidence when something goes wrong. One thing I'll point to is what a lot of platforms are trying to do now around different kinds of abuse on their services, particularly a service called Lumen, which is emerging, and that is a signal sharing a Lantern, sorry, Lumen exists. Lantern is a signal sharing cooperative across different platforms, AI companies, social media platforms and others, that tries to say, well, what patterns of user behavior are we seeing? Or what do you know about this user? What do you know about this one that we think is abusive? Because a lot of that requires gathering evidence. So the private governance side of that is turning into a kind of evidential machine, which is quite interesting and it's quite new. We have another question from Shushu Lijian. The question there effectively asks around in the LLM, how technical is it? Because understanding the technology is really key. So this is obviously not a computer science degree, but in particularly in the module that I co-lead in the LLM, the data law and algorithmic regulation module, we fully look at the deep technical understanding of AI systems so that you can really build a strong lead bridge from the technical understanding to the legal analysis. And that's probably quite unique, I think, about our law modules in that space. And we do a similar thing with media law, bringing a lot of theory that relates to the way that platforms work and moderate. We've been running for several years now executive education to trained lawyers, where we teach them, it's called AI for Lawyers, and we teach them the technical underpinnings of AI so that they can understand it for law. So we do this in-house in laws, and we keep really ahead of the curve, I think. And so certainly, while you won't come up with an MSc, it's a technically rigorous module, but not one that you should be scared of. We're not going to teach you to code. So there. And I suppose just to clarify a few of the questions people had around the law and technology LLM, it's something that you can choose when you get it here. So even if you applied for a different specialism, if you arrive and you decide, actually, I did this, but I'd love to take the law and technology one, or vice versa. You can make that choice later. It's effectively going to be based on a combination of the modules you take and also the topic of your research essay. And so you do, those are the two components that add up to make the specialism. And if you come, that's that at the moment, that's not a problem, and you can choose the law and technology modules. And you could also choose the law and technology modules, and maybe you just want to have the general LLM, and you just want to say LLM in law, and that's also fine. So either one of those, it depends on what you want to appear to future employers, is the most important consideration there. But of course, we'll be there as the law and technology team if you choose a law and technology specialism to support you and to connect to you and to create a community around the students on that specialism.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Michael. The next question I'd like to ask, potentially Sarah can start and then our admissions team can jump in as needed. But there's a question here that says, is it possible for non-law students to apply? I'm currently studying at the University of Bath doing a BSc in sociology and social policy.
That's quite an easy question to answer. The answer is really no. You need to have an undergraduate degree or equivalent in law.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah.
There's another related question on that. Someone asked about a PhD in law, focusing on AI without prior legal qualifications. That may be possible. So our PhD program, if you show interest and development aptitude in law, we do have people, including technologists, who come to study a law PhD with us. So that's a slightly different thing from our LLM, because a research project might not build in the same way on that doctrinal knowledge and foundation that we would require the LLM student. So I saw the question about the PhD student, that is a bit of a different situation. But you can check, it's all very carefully worded in all of our application materials, the requirements there.
Thank you very much, Michael. So my next question is for our alumni. There's a question here that says, how would you describe the workload during the LLM? Did you find it manageable alongside having a life outside of studying, or was it quite full on?
I can answer this. I'm a current student in LLM. I think the workload is not so easy to handle, but workable. You can handle your reading materials well, make some travelings around Europe. So I think the life is really wonderful. Yeah, and I met lots of good friends here. Yeah.
Thank you, Yuki. Any of the others want to comment?
I agree.
You go first.
I was going to say, I do agree with Yuki, like you can definitely have a life outside of it. And I'd say try to do that anyway. I'd say in terms of readings, I was doing around like 6 hours of reading per day. And that was recommended through the academic legal writing program. And then on top of that, you'd have to obviously prepare for your classes so you know what's actually going on. But try and get your hobbies in your day-to-day life anyway. So if you like working out, try and get that in. And there's also loads of UCL events anyway where they'll try and get you guys to become social with each other. So, go out with your friends and do all of that. But I'd say for me, it was quite intense, but it's definitely workable, like Yuki said.
Perfect, thank you. We'll go to Roy next and then Katrina.
Yeah. So in my case, I think it was definitely very intense. We have to do a lot of reading for every class, and I think the classes are really interactive. So we're expected to have read those materials before we come to the classroom. And exactly because of the nature of how internationalized this program is, we have the chance, I think it's a valuable opportunity to exchange the knowledge of different legal systems with our classmates as well. So definitely do our homework and read the materials, and then to share our insights with others. I think it will even be more intensive during the assessment period. I remember I stayed at the IELTS, like the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, for 2 months, but very luckily I was fighting this battle with my friends, like my dear friends I met in this LLM. I actually just met them 2 weeks ago when I took like 34 hours flight to Chile. So you'll meet people from literally all around the world, and it will be a great experience to study with them and try to strike a balance between social life and also academic life as well.
yeah, would echo everything that everyone said. I find it was quite intense, and especially as Roy just said, during the assessment period, that was a lot of work. But I was just going to add that I did quite a lot of pro bono through UCL. So I took part in a Client Earth clinic where we were developing some work for them, and Gulsum did it as well. And I did some other pro bono work, which ended up taking quite a lot of time. So sometimes I wasn't studying as much as I should because I was doing a lot of the pro bono work. But actually, that for me was equally important for my experience in terms of meeting people, but also just the experience I got from it. And certainly when I got a new job after I finished the masters, I don't think I would have got that job without having done the pro bono work that I did at UCL. So I definitely think it's worth trying to fit that in.
That's perfect. Thank you all so much. The next question, Michael, I'll come to you if that's okay. So there's a question here that says, I am an incoming LLM student at UCL and I wanted to understand the subjects for the specialism in the law and technology. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about the kind of modules that you'd be studying if you were on that specialism?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I've got to remember them all now, but I think I can. So the specialism for law and technology is really wide. Law and technology is a big space, but it requires they have a lot of common themes and to build a really solid grounding. So we have a new module this year, several new modules actually coming up this year. So two major new modules, data law and algorithmic regulation. So that is an expansion of a previous module. We had privacy and data law. You might have seen that if you've looked at past students and talked to them. So part of it will resemble that module, and it will have an extra 10 weeks focusing on AI and algorithmic systems. So it's a fully fledged and very interlinked module that connects a lot of issues around data and AI in society, both the technological side of how they work, but different legal regimes and how those legal regimes are emerging internationally and interacting with these technologies and finding challenges and tensions. So that's taught by me, by Professor Michael Veale, by Professor Orla Linsky, who is a world expert on data protection law, who's really one of the top people in the world for this, and Dr. Tommaso Fia, who is an expert on private law and data law. So looking at how different organizations kind of share data and construct mechanisms across companies to share data, for example, and to move it and transfer it. We also have media and information law from press to platforms. That's led by a colleague, Dr. Jeevan Hariharan, who is an expert in issues around privacy, technology, is practiced for many years, is one of the sort of expert private lawyers we have in the faculty and media lawyers. And that connects questions of online social media with classic newspapers, with challenges around information and free expression to really draw a picture that gives you a grounding of modern social media regulation in how things worked out in the past. We then have competition law and the intangible economy. So this is an aspect that kind of blends some competition law and IP together to focus on things that are good services that are harder to reason about. And that's a half module, so that's a 22.5 credit module. That's a 10-week module. National security law, this is taught by Professor Tom Hickman, who is one of the UK's leading barristers in national security law. And often you'll have chances to visit chambers and meet lots of national security law barristers, practitioners. As you know, keep it between us, there's lots of people from intelligence agencies who may or may not come in and give guest lectures and things like that. And Dr. Bernard Keenan and Dr. Ewan Smith, all of whom are experts in that area. We have the IP courses, patents and copyright. They also feature on the law and technology specialism. Trademarks doesn't because it's less technological, but the patents and copyright ones do. And I'll let the IP colleagues talk in other domains more to that, but they're quite elaborate on the website, and you might know what to expect in those. And there's also the fintech and banking module as well, so that focuses more on the financial side of things. And that's run by Iris Chew and Alan Brenner, Professor Iris Chew and Dr. Alan Brenner. Great. So yeah, happy to answer questions about those. And I can see there's a few questions about can you switch between. I don't know if you want to take those, maybe the Alan team. The broad answer is yes, we'd love to have you in the law and technology module. We know that was announced later on. If you have applied for a different thing, I think you can get in touch if you want a sort of formal acknowledgement of your ability to swap, if that would make you more comfortable. But you can also take it from us that, if you want to come and say, actually, I'd rather do a different specialism, then you're not bound to it. But I'll let other people.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, Thank you, Michael. That was going to be the next thing I was going to ask, and basically reassure everybody that absolutely you are still able to change your specialism. And we know that we've announced this particular one later on. So if you already have an offer for a different specialism or you've not yet applied, you can either apply for the general and then switch when you're here, or if you've already got that offer, you can switch. So just to reassure those people about that.
And the page looks scary. When you apply for a big LLM page, you see all these millions of options. Sorry about that. We've tried to get that sort of sorted out and be a bit clearer, but don't be deterred. You choose an LLM, you get a response, you get your offer. The main thing to think about is whether you're full-time, part-time, or flexi. That is an important thing. The other things look a bit scary. Do email if that looks a bit daunting, but you know, don't be deterred that you weren't locked into one of these millions long lists. It's just, you know, law and technology. We're all stuck with some technologies, and at the moment we're just stuck with that one. But we're going to be fixing that hard. But it's just something for another day. So please do chat with our wonderful team, who will guide you through the process if you need.
Thanks very much, Michael. I've got a question here. There's some kind of around assessments, and so Alex, I wonder if you'd be able to come in on these. So we've got one question here which says, will assessments be in person, or will there be the option to complete assessments through online submission? And then we also have a question later on, which is around modules being assessed in term 3, or are there also mid-term assessments?
Thanks, Atalanta. Basically, all of modules in laws and generally around UCL have a in-person element, or totally in person. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, if you look on the module catalogue, it will tell you what the assessment type is for each module, but every module will have an in-person assessed type. That changes depending on the module, so it's best to look on the module catalogue. And sorry, what was the second part to that?
Are the assessments in term 3, or do some of the modules have kind of mid-term assessments?
Sure. So at UCL, there is a main assessment period, which takes place from the end of April to the end of May. I believe there occasionally are modules that are only taught in term 1 that may have an assessment deadline in January, but that is very few and far between. The majority of them are only assessed in the main assessment period, which has just happened here.
Perfect, thank you. There's also just a follow-up question from someone else that says, please can someone shed light on the examination pattern? Is it a closed book exam where we need to learn from the study materials provided, or is it more of an open book and take home?
Shall I take that one?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it differs across the different modules. We don't have many modules where it's an open book in the exam hall. We really find that people bring in far too much and they don't focus on the actual question. But rest assured, all of the examinations of the modules are designed so that you're assessing your thinking skills. We're not assessing like deep, long memorization, ability to remember article numbers and case names. You know, that's a helpful thing sometimes to show that you're fluent in something. I'm not going to downplay that totally. However, people get very worried because they think, oh, they want to, have all the materials in front of them to be able to read from them. The questions are designed for the context that the exam happens in. And so broadly, they're closed books. Some modules provide some additional materials, so a statute or readings that are connected to that. But they're not questions that would, we're not imagining that you have access to all these other materials. We're really interested in what you think and feel about those questions, how you argue critically, how you appraise them given the time available. And when people mark these questions, we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is in an exam hall in that situation. And I know that's hard to imagine, but we're obviously not imagining you're making the perfect thing that you would have 3 days to craft, or 4 days, or a week at home to think and refine over a long period of time. And I've got to say, people do outstandingly in these closed book assessments, really, really well. And one thing we just hear from people time and time again, year after year, is, oh, it was refreshing. They're done now. They're like, there's a moment of like closure where people go out of their last exam hall. They don't have coursework hanging over them over the summer that they need to do with millions of clashing deadlines at the same time. Yeah, it feels daunting, but then there's a moment and it's finished and you can really breathe. And that's, I think, something that we just hear again and again. And it's an important formative moment. And many of our, I don't know if the alumni here feel the same, but some people feel that was quite transformational, I've heard, to them and quite important to their own development.
Oh, may I add something?
Of course.
Yeah, I think the assessments are much more easier to handle than you thought. You may be frightened before you take the assessments, but after you came in the UCL London, you will find it's much more easier than you thought. You can pick like for 3 hours exam, you can pick 3 questions from 9 questions. So you can skip those questions like, I have no idea about that. I can choose another one. And all these exams are spread in a whole month. So I took 4 assessments in person last month, and I still have enough time to prepare for each of them. And as for some students, if you have some issues, some problems, you can apply for the DAP or EC to make yourself feel better. Yeah. So I think you can handle it. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. So we probably only have time for one more question. So I think it would be nice just to kind of ask our alumni if they've got any other words of wisdom or advice to share for those who have either applied already or who are thinking about applying to the LLM at UCL.
I'd say start on the research essay as soon as you can. Not necessarily to kind of rush through it, but like I said, like before you start the course, it would be nice if you have an array of topics that you can choose from. But as you go through the course, if you can put in a few hours a week, it will just make it a lot easier for you in the end when the assessment period arises, because as we said, the assessment period is intense, and you do want to make sure that you're putting a lot of time into preparing for your actual modules. But if you can do a few hours a week for the research essay, like you won't regret it in the end. And a lot of I did that, and a lot of my friends did that. And it was a lot easier for us versus people that kind of left it to the end. So I'd say don't leave a research essay to the end. Just do it throughout the year and start thinking about it now.
That's perfect. Thank you. Katrina?
Yeah, I was one of those people who left it. I just thought about it so much and couldn't decide what I wanted to cover. So try and get your idea and just run with it early on. I was just going to say, like hang out outside UCL more. I hung out with people like my friends in the library in between classes and stuff, but we didn't actually like go for drinks that often because everyone was just really busy studying. And now I look back and wish that we had done that more, because now everyone's in different places and working and in different countries. So I think, yeah, make the most of being in London and being in a great area where UCL is and socialise outside of UCL.
Perfect, thank you. Roy?
Yeah, I do agree with the advice of starting your research essay as soon as possible. I remember that I was starting to read different books since term 1, and that would be easier and more manageable to for the end of the like term 3 at the end of the LLM. And for social life, I would recommend. I still think that that was the best year in my life. Be prepared for all forms of cultural shock, all forms of jokes told by different languages, and also be prepared for amazing people, because I actually learned a lot from them. I think I was among the youngest ones because I was kind of like fresh graduates, but then a lot of them have experience. They have their own expertise. Some of them are government lawyers, some of them have their own law firms. I'm still very amazed by all of their achievements, and they're able to teach me a lot of things. And outside of this, like more pragmatic or like more vocational based stuff, like do find some time to travel with your friends as well, even just in the UK or in Europe. I think it would be amazing. Like it would be all memorable experiences, and do stay connected with them. I feel like they're my chosen family even until now. So do enjoy.
Perfect, thank you. So that's all we've got time for today. So as we come to the end of this session, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, our panelists and our student representatives for joining us today and sharing their really helpful insights. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending and for all of the thoughtful questions that you've put into the chat. If you'd like any further information about the UCL LLM, and in particular the Law and Technology specialism, then please do visit the UCL Laws website or contact our admissions team, who will be more than happy to help with any further queries. We hope that you found today's session really useful, and we look forward to welcoming many of you to UCL Laws in the future. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you for having us.